The silence in my empty house had become unbearable after Margaret's funeral. 53 years old, widowed after 27 years of marriage, I found myself staring at the walls of our Denver home, wondering if this was all that remained. The mortgage was paid, the kids were grown and scattered across the country, and suddenly the American dream felt more like a prison of memories. That's when I made a decision that would nearly destroy everything I had left. I joined an international dating site, searching for someone who could fill the void that Margaret's absence had carved into my chest. What I found instead was a nightmare disguised as love, a web of lies and cultural manipulation that would drag me halfway around the world and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about trust, family, and survival. If you're watching this story unfold, please hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you might save you from making the same mistakes I did. This isn't just entertainment, this is a warning wrapped in a confession. Robert Harrison had spent his entire adult life playing by the rules. Born in small-town Colorado, he'd worked his way up from a junior accountant to regional manager at a mid-sized insurance firm. He met Margaret in college, married her 2 years after graduation, bought the house with the white picket fence, raised 2 children who grew up to be successful professionals, living their own lives on opposite coasts. It was the textbook American success story, complete with a comfortable retirement plan and weekend golf games with neighbours who'd known him for decades. But success stories, Robert discovered, can crumble in the span of 18 months. First came Margaret's diagnosis, delivered in a sterile oncologist's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, maybe 6 months if they were lucky. They weren't lucky. Margaret lasted 14 months, fighting with a grace that humbled Robert and a strength that made him realise how much of his own strength had always depended on her. When she finally slipped away on a humid August evening, Robert felt like he was drowning in air. The house became a mausoleum. Every corner held a memory, every routine a reminder of absence. His children called regularly, worried about their father's increasingly monosyllabic responses and his tendency to skip meals. His friends tried to drag him to barbecues and fishing trips, but Robert felt like he was watching life through bulletproof glass, present but unable to touch or be touched by anything real. The loneliness wasn't just emotional, it was physical, a constant ache in his chest that no amount of whiskey or late-night television could numb. 6 months after the funeral, sitting in his den at 2 in the morning, Robert found himself creating a profile on asianlove.com. He told himself he was just browsing, just curious about what was out there. He wasn't looking to replace Margaret, nobody could do that. But maybe, just maybe, he could find someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't look at him with the careful pity his friends had perfected. Someone who didn't know about his loss and could see him as something other than a broken widower. The profile he created was honest about his age and situation, though he softened the edges. Recently widowed rather than devastated by grief. Comfortable rather than wealthy. Looking for companionship rather than desperately lonely. He uploaded a photo from his son's wedding the year before Margaret got sick, where he looked relaxed and genuinely happy. Within hours, messages began appearing in his inbox, dozens of them, from women with exotic names and photographs that seemed too beautiful to be real. That's when he saw her message. Simple, direct, with none of the flowery language that filled the others. Her name was Siraporn. She was 32, lived in Bangkok, and worked as a teacher. Her photograph showed a woman with intelligent eyes and a smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. She wrote in careful English about her love of books and her dream of travelling. She asked about his work, his hobbies, his thoughts on life. She didn't mention money, marriage, or moving to America. She seemed curious about him as a person rather than as a ticket to a better life. Robert found himself looking forward to her messages with an intensity that surprised him. Siraporn wrote about her students, her small apartment near the Chao Phraya River, her weekend visits to temples where she found peace. She asked thoughtful questions about American culture, about his children, about what it felt like to live in Colorado mountains. Her English improved noticeably over their weeks of correspondence, and she began sharing more personal details. Her father had died when she was young. She'd never married because she'd been focused on her career and caring for her mother. She sometimes felt trapped by expectations, but dreamed of seeing the world beyond Thailand's borders. 3 months into their correspondence, Robert made a decision that his rational mind knew was reckless, but his heart couldn't resist. He booked a 2-week trip to Bangkok, telling himself it was just a vacation, a chance to see a different part of the world and maybe meet an interesting woman. He didn't tell his children about Siraporn, sensing they weren't ready to hear about their father's romantic interests. He simply announced he was taking a trip to Thailand, his first international travel since his honeymoon 28 years earlier. Siraporn met him at Suvarnabhumi Airport, and Robert's first thought was that she was even more beautiful in person. Petite and graceful, with long black hair that caught the terminal's fluorescent lights, she moved through the crowd with an easy confidence that made him feel clumsy and American in the worst possible way. But when she saw him, her face lit up with what seemed like genuine joy, and when she hugged him, he caught the scent of jasmine and something else, something that reminded him of rain on hot pavement. She'd arranged for a car to take them to his hotel, a modest but clean place in the Solom district that she'd recommended for its proximity to temples and markets. During the ride through Bangkok's chaotic traffic, she pointed out landmarks and explained the history behind the buildings they passed. Her knowledge was impressive, her enthusiasm infectious, and Robert found himself relaxing for the first time in months. This woman wasn't trying to impress him with rehearsed charm, she was sharing something she genuinely loved. The 2 weeks passed like a dream he didn't want to wake from. Siraporn took time off from her teaching job to show him the city, from the golden spires of the Grand Palace to the floating markets where vendors sold everything from mangoes to antique Buddhas. They ate at street stalls where Robert learned to navigate chopsticks and discovered flavours that made his tongue burn and his eyes water with pleasure. They visited temples where she explained the meaning behind the intricate carvings and the proper way to make offerings. In the evenings, they walked along the river, talking about everything and nothing, while the city's lights reflected on the dark water like fallen stars. But more than the sightseeing, Robert treasured their quiet moments. The way Siraporn would place her small hand on his arm when she was making a point, the sound of her laughter when he tried to pronounce Thai words, the serious expression that crossed her face when she was translating something complex from Thai to English. She listened to his stories about Margaret without jealousy or impatience, understanding somehow that his grief wasn't an obstacle to new love, but an essential part of who he was. She shared her own losses, her fears about growing older without family, her dreams of teaching children in other countries someday. On his last night in Bangkok, as they sat on the balcony of a riverside restaurant watching long-tail boats navigate between larger vessels, Siraporn reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin was soft and warm, her touch gentle but firm. She told him she'd never felt so comfortable with a man, so understood and appreciated. She said she knew he had to return to America, but she hoped this wasn't goodbye forever. The words hung in the humid air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Robert returned to Denver changed. The house no longer felt like a tomb, it felt like a temporary way station. He found himself researching Thai culture, attempting to learn basic Thai phrases, and counting the days until he could return to Bangkok. His correspondence with Siraporn intensified, evolving from friendly exchanges to intimate conversations about their hopes for the future. She began calling him on WhatsApp, and hearing her voice made the distance between them feel both infinite and insignificant. 3 months later, Robert was back on a plane to Thailand, this time for a month-long stay. Siraporn met him at the airport again, but this time her greeting was different, more tentative. She seemed nervous about something, playing with her hair in a way he hadn't noticed before. During the drive to his hotel, she mentioned that her mother was eager to meet him, that she'd told her family about their relationship and they were curious about the American man who'd captured their daughter's attention. That's when Robert realised their relationship had moved beyond casual dating in Siraporn's mind, and possibly in his own. The thought should have terrified him, given how recently he'd lost Margaret, but instead it filled him with a warmth he'd thought he'd never feel again. Maybe it was possible to love twice in one lifetime. Maybe Margaret would have wanted him to find happiness again. Siraporn had arranged for him to meet her family on his 3rd day in Bangkok. They lived in a traditional Thai house in the Thonburi district, across the river from the main city, reached by a combination of subway, boat and tuk-tuk that left Robert feeling like he'd travelled not just across the city, but across centuries. The house was built on stilts, with intricate wooden carvings and a small garden where chickens pecked at insects and an ancient-looking dog slept in the shade of a mango tree. Her mother, Siraporn explained, spoke no English, but she'd prepared a special meal in his honour. Her two brothers would be there, along with an uncle who'd served as the family patriarch since her father's death. Siraporn seemed more nervous about this meeting than she had about anything else, adjusting her clothing repeatedly and coaching Robert on proper greetings and gift-giving etiquette. The family home felt like stepping into another world. The main room was dominated by a shrine to Buddha, and what Siraporn explained were photographs of deceased family members, including her father, a serious-looking man in military uniform. The furniture was simple but elegant. Dark wood carved with intricate patterns, cushions covered in silk that caught the light streaming through latticed windows. The smell of incense, mixed with cooking spices, created an atmosphere that was both sacred and homely. Her mother was a tiny woman who looked much older than what Robert calculated her age should be, her face deeply lined but her eyes sharp and assessing. She greeted him with a traditional Y, hands pressed together in front of her chest, bowing slightly. Robert attempted to return the gesture, earning what might have been approval or amusement, he couldn't tell which. Her brothers were more modern in their appearance, dressed in Western clothing and speaking heavily accented but functional English. They asked polite questions about his flight, his impressions of Thailand, his work in America. The uncle was different. Older than the others, with greying hair and an expensive-looking watch, he carried himself with an authority that made the others defer to him. He spoke excellent English with a British accent, explaining that he'd studied in London years earlier and now ran several businesses in Bangkok. He was charming and knowledgeable, asking intelligent questions about American politics and economics, but Robert sensed he was being evaluated rather than simply welcomed. The meal was elaborate, course after course of dishes Robert couldn't identify but found delicious. Siraporn sat beside him, quietly translating when conversation became too rapid or complex for him to follow, occasionally serving food onto his plate with the careful attention of a devoted girlfriend. Her family seemed pleased by his attempts to use chopsticks, his compliments about the food, his obvious affection for their daughter. But as the evening progressed, Robert began to notice undercurrents he couldn't quite understand. Conversations in Thai that stopped when he looked up, meaningful glances between family members. A tension that seemed to increase rather than decrease as everyone became more comfortable. When Siraporn excused herself to help her mother in the kitchen, her uncle leaned forward and fixed Robert with a direct stare. They spoke, the uncle explained, about Siraporn's future. She was no longer young by Thai standards, past the age when most women married and started families. She'd devoted herself to her career and her family obligations, sacrificing her own desires for the good of others. Now she'd found someone who could give her the life she deserved, but there were traditions to consider, customs that must be respected. Robert nodded politely, assuming this was leading to some kind of blessing or advice about treating Siraporn well. Instead, the uncle began explaining Thai marriage customs, the importance of proving one's ability to provide for a wife, the traditional exchange of gifts between families. In the old days, he said, a man would present gold, money, or property to demonstrate his commitment and his worth. Modern couples often simplified these customs, but they shouldn't be ignored entirely. When Siraporn returned from the kitchen, the conversation shifted back to lighter topics, but Robert felt like he'd been given a test he didn't know he was taking. As they prepared to leave, her mother pressed small wrapped packages into his hands, gifts of food and incense, while speaking rapidly in Thai. Siraporn translated. Her mother said she could see he made her daughter happy and she prayed Buddha would bless their relationship. Walking back to catch their tuk-tuk, Robert asked Siraporn about her uncle's comments regarding marriage traditions. She seemed embarrassed, explaining that her family was old-fashioned about some things, that they worried about her future security. She assured him they weren't expecting anything specific, just wanted to know his intentions were serious. Robert found himself saying that they were more serious than he'd admitted to himself until that moment. That night, lying in his hotel bed with the sounds of Bangkok traffic filtering through the windows, Robert tried to process what he was feeling. He'd come to Thailand looking for companionship, maybe some adventure to break up the monotony of grief. Instead, he'd found something that felt like love, complicated by cultural differences he didn't fully understand and family expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. But when he thought about returning to Denver without Siriporn, the idea filled him with a despair that rivaled what he'd felt after Margaret's death. The next morning, Siriporn seemed different, more clingy and emotional than usual. She talked about how much she'd miss him when he returned to America, how difficult it was to have found happiness only to face separation again. She mentioned almost casually that her uncle had offered to help if Robert was serious about their relationship, that he had connections who could expedite visa applications and handle the bureaucratic complexities of international marriage. Robert found himself saying yes before he'd fully thought through what he was agreeing to. Yes, he was serious about their relationship. Yes, he wanted to explore the possibility of marriage. Yes, he would appreciate any help her family could provide in navigating the legal requirements. Siriporn's reaction was immediate and overwhelming, tears of joy streaming down her face as she threw her arms around him and whispered promises of eternal love and devotion. What followed felt like being swept along by a current he couldn't control. Meetings with her uncle to discuss visa applications and marriage procedures. Visits to government offices where forms were filled out in Thai and English, where official-looking stamps were applied to documents Robert couldn't read. Conversations about wedding ceremonies, about where they would live, about timeline and logistics that seemed to accelerate with each discussion. Siriporn quit her teaching job, explaining that she needed time to prepare for their marriage and eventual move to America. Her family threw a small engagement party where Robert was presented with a bill for traditional gifts he was expected to provide, gold jewellery for Siriporn and cash payments to her family that totalled more than he'd expected but seemed manageable given his savings and retirement accounts. But there were other costs, smaller at first, that began to accumulate. Processing fees for documents, transportation costs for family members who needed to travel for various ceremonies, medical examinations required for visa applications, translation services, legal consultations. Each expense was reasonable when explained individually, but together they were draining his savings faster than he'd anticipated. More troubling were the stories that began to emerge about family difficulties. Siriporn's mother needed medical treatment that wasn't covered by Thailand's healthcare system. One of her brothers had fallen behind on his mortgage and was facing foreclosure. The family's small business was struggling due to economic conditions, and they were having trouble making loan payments to local creditors who were not patient or forgiving. Robert found himself writing cheques and making wire transfers, each time assured this was a temporary situation, that the family would repay him once their circumstances improved. Siriporn was mortified by these requests, claiming she had no idea her family was planning to ask for help, but she couldn't bear to see her mother suffer or her brother lose his home. These were the people who would soon be his family too, she reminded him, and in Thai culture, family took care of each other. 6 months into what had become a complicated and expensive engagement process, Robert received a call that changed everything. His daughter Sarah, calling from Portland, had done something Robert had never thought to do. She'd hired a private investigator to research Siriporn and her family, worried about her father's sudden engagement to a woman half his age whom he'd met online. The investigator's report was devastating. Siriporn's real name was Siriporn Thanakit, and she was indeed a teacher, but she was also married to a Thai man named Chaiwat with whom she had 2 children. Her family did live in the house Robert had visited, but it wasn't their house. It belonged to her uncle, who ran several businesses that operated in legal grey areas, including marriage brokerage services for wealthy foreign men. The medical bills, mortgage problems, and business difficulties were fabricated. Siriporn had been working with her uncle to identify and exploit wealthy widowers and divorcees, men who were emotionally vulnerable and financially comfortable. The uncle's role was to provide legitimacy and handle the legal and financial aspects of the scam, while Siriporn provided the emotional manipulation that kept victims sending money long after they should have recognised the pattern. Most shocking of all, Robert wasn't her first victim. The investigator had identified at least 3 other American men who'd been through similar experiences with Siriporn over the past 5 years, each believing he was her first serious foreign boyfriend, each contributing thousands of dollars to various family emergencies and wedding preparations before finally cutting contact or being discarded when their resources were exhausted. Sarah read the report to Robert over the phone, her voice tight with anger and concern. She'd already contacted local police and the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Centre, though she warned him that international online romance scams were difficult to prosecute and even harder to recover money from. Her main concern was stopping him from sending any more money and getting him home safely. Robert listened to his daughter's words in a hotel room in Bangkok, looking out at the city where he'd thought he'd found love, feeling like the world was tilting sideways. Everything he'd experienced with Siriporn, every emotion and moment of connection, suddenly seemed suspect. Had any of it been real? Had she felt anything genuine for him, or was he simply a mark, a target chosen for his vulnerability and financial resources? But even with the evidence laid out in black and white, part of Robert resisted believing it. The woman he'd fallen in love with couldn't be the calculating predator described in the investigator's report. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up if he just talked to Siriporn directly. That evening, when Siriporn arrived at his hotel for their dinner date, Robert confronted her with what he'd learned. He watched her face carefully, looking for signs of guilt or deception, hoping to see surprise and indignation that would prove the investigator wrong. Instead, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. For just a moment before she composed herself and began to cry, he saw relief. Her tears were immediate and convincing, her denials passionate and detailed. She claimed the investigator had confused her with someone else, that she'd never been married, that her family's financial problems were real and urgent. She accused his daughter of racism and jealousy, of trying to sabotage their relationship because she couldn't accept her father finding happiness with an Asian woman. For a moment, Robert wanted to believe her. It would have been easier than accepting that everything he'd felt for the past year had been based on lies. But then Siriporn made a mistake. She pulled out her phone to show him photos that would prove her innocence, and Robert saw a text message notification pop up on the screen. It was in Thai, but it included a number he recognised as the amount of money he'd wired to help with her mother's medical bills and what looked like a laughing emoji. That's when Siriporn's mask finally slipped completely. Seeing that Robert had noticed the message, she stopped crying and looked at him with an expression that was cold and calculating. She told him he'd been useful but not particularly smart, that American men were easy targets because they were so desperate for attention and affection. She explained with clinical detachment how she and her uncle had researched him before their first contact, how they'd crafted her messages to appeal to his specific psychological profile, how they'd designed each family crisis to extract maximum money with minimum suspicion. She stood up from the restaurant table, smoothing her dress and checking her appearance in the window's reflection. She thanked him, sarcastically, for funding her real family's comfortable lifestyle and contributing to her uncle's business expansion. She mentioned that she'd already identified her next victim, an Australian widower who seemed even more lonely and generous than Robert had been. Before leaving, she leaned down and whispered something that would haunt Robert for months afterward. She told him she almost felt sorry for him because he'd really believed someone like her could love someone like him. She said he should go home and accept that his romantic life had ended with Margaret's death because no woman would want a broken, desperate old man unless she was being paid to pretend. Please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment about whether you or someone you know has ever experienced something similar to what I'm describing. These stories are more common than people realise, and sharing experiences can help others avoid the same traps. Robert spent his last 3 days in Bangkok in a haze of humiliation and rage. He'd lost over $80,000 to Siriporn and her family, money that had come from his retirement savings, his emergency fund, and a loan against his house. But the financial loss, devastating as it was, hurt less than the emotional betrayal. Every memory of their time together was now poisoned by the knowledge that it had all been performance, that her smiles and touches and whispered endearments had been calculated manipulations designed to extract money from a lonely fool. He tried to contact Thai police about filing charges, but the officer he spoke with explained that international romance scams were rarely prosecuted successfully, especially when the victims had willingly sent money and participated in what appeared to be legitimate cultural exchanges. The evidence threshold was high, and most victims were reluctant to testify because of embarrassment about how they'd been deceived. Robert's humiliation deepened when he realised how many warning signs he'd ignored. The rapid progression of their relationship, the convenient family crises that always required immediate financial help, the way Siriporn had quit her job so quickly, the elaborate wedding preparations that seemed designed more to extract money than to actually culminate in marriage. His grief and loneliness had made him vulnerable to manipulation that should have been obvious to someone with his business experience. But what tormented him most was the realization that he'd been chosen specifically because of his vulnerabilities. Siriporn and her uncle hadn't randomly targeted him. They'd identified him as an ideal victim through his dating profile and online presence. His recent widowhood, his comfortable financial situation, his obvious loneliness and need for companionship, even his age and cultural background, had all been factors in their decision to pursue him. The flight back to Denver felt like a journey through purgatory. Robert sat in his coach seat, surrounded by chattering passengers excited about their Thai vacations, replaying every conversation and interaction with Siriporn, trying to identify the exact moments when he should have recognised the deception. He thought about Margaret, wondering what she would have said about his situation, whether she would have been disappointed in his gullibility or sympathetic to his need for companionship. His children met him at the airport, their faces showing a mixture of relief and concern that made Robert feel even worse about what he'd put them through. Sarah had clearly been crying, and his son Michael looked like he wanted to hit something. They drove him home in silence, past familiar landmarks that seemed foreign after his months of dreaming about a different life in a different country. The house that had felt like a prison before his trip to Thailand now felt like a refuge, but it was a refuge haunted by his own stupidity. Every room reminded him not just of Margaret's death, but of his own naive plans to build a new life with a woman who had never existed except as a carefully constructed fiction designed to exploit his loneliness. The financial aftermath was almost as devastating as the emotional betrayal. Robert had to take out a second mortgage on his house to cover the money he'd sent to Thailand, money that would never be recovered. His retirement timeline shifted from months to years, and his comfortable financial cushion had evaporated. He had to cancel plans to help his son with a down payment on a house, had to decline his daughter's request for help with his grandchildren's college funds. But the psychological damage was harder to quantify and impossible to resolve with loans or budget adjustments. Robert found himself questioning every relationship and interaction, wondering if people were being genuine or if they saw him as another potential mark. Cashiers who smiled too broadly, neighbours who asked about his well-being, even his own children's expressions of concern all seemed potentially suspicious. He stopped answering his phone unless he recognised the number, stopped checking his email except for work-related messages, stopped engaging in social situations where he might meet new people. The loneliness that had driven him to seek companionship online had been replaced by a paranoid isolation that felt safer but infinitely more depressing. Sleep became elusive, filled with dreams where Siriporn appeared as both the loving woman he'd thought he knew and the calculating predator she'd revealed herself to be. He would wake up reaching for someone who had never really been there, then remember with crushing clarity that every tender moment had been a performance designed to separate him from his money. His daughter Sarah, worried about her father's deteriorating mental state, convinced him to see a therapist who specialised in fraud victims. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, explained that romance scams were among the most psychologically damaging crimes because they attacked victims' most basic human needs for love and connection. She helped Robert understand that he hadn't been stupid or unusually gullible, that the people who perpetrated these scams were skilled manipulators who studied their victims carefully and exploited specific psychological vulnerabilities. She explained that the shame and self-blame he was experiencing were normal reactions but counterproductive ones that would impede his recovery. The therapy sessions were difficult, requiring Robert to examine not just his relationship with Siriporn, but his grief over Margaret's death, his fears about ageing and mortality, his assumptions about love and relationships. He had to confront the reality that his marriage to Margaret, while loving and successful, had perhaps made him naive about the complexities of romantic relationships outside the context of long-term partnership. Gradually, with professional help and the support of his children, Robert began to rebuild his sense of self-worth and his trust in his own judgment. He started volunteering at a local literacy program, using his business skills to help adults improve their reading and math abilities. The work gave him purpose and connected him with people who appreciated his contributions without any hidden agendas. He also began speaking about his experience, first in therapy group sessions with other fraud victims, then at community centres and senior organisations where people gathered to learn about online safety. Sharing his story was humiliating at first, but he discovered that many people had similar experiences or knew someone who did. His willingness to talk openly about his mistakes began to feel less like confession and more like public service. Robert learned that romance scams had become increasingly sophisticated and widespread, targeting not just lonely seniors but people of all ages who were going through transitions or difficulties in their personal lives. The scammers often worked in organised groups, sharing information about victims and techniques, using social media and dating sites to identify and groom targets over months or years. He also learned that very few victims ever recovered their money, and even fewer saw their scammers prosecuted. The international nature of most romance scams made law enforcement difficult, and the shame associated with being victimised kept many people from reporting the crimes at all. Robert realised that his willingness to speak publicly about his experience was unusual and potentially valuable for preventing others from falling into similar traps. 18 months after returning from Thailand, Robert received an unexpected email from a woman in Australia. She explained that she'd seen a video of one of his presentations online and wanted to thank him for sharing his story. She'd been corresponding with a Thai woman who seemed very similar to Siriporn, and Robert's description of the warning signs had made her realise she was being targeted for a scam. The email led to a phone conversation, then to contact with other potential victims who'd found Robert's story online. He began maintaining an informal network of people who shared information about suspected romance scammers, comparing photos and stories to identify patterns and warn potential victims. The work was time-consuming and often frustrating, but it gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. 2 years after his return from Thailand, Robert met Helen at the Literacy Centre where he volunteered. She was a widow in her late 40s who'd started volunteering after her husband died in a car accident. Their friendship developed slowly, based on shared work and common interests, rather than the intense romantic chemistry that had characterised his relationship with Siriporn. Helen knew about Robert's experience in Thailand from the beginning, having heard him speak at a community safety seminar. Her awareness of his vulnerability to manipulation, rather than making her suspicious or judgmental, seemed to make her more patient and understanding about his cautious approach to relationships. She appreciated his honesty about his mistakes and his commitment to helping others avoid similar experiences. Their relationship developed over months of shared volunteer work, casual coffee meetings, and conversations about books and movies and the complexities of rebuilding life after loss. When Robert finally asked Helen out on an actual date, it felt natural and unforced, based on genuine compatibility rather than desperate loneliness or exotic fantasy. 3 years after his return from Thailand, Robert stood in his backyard at a small wedding ceremony, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Helen's family and friends, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by his volunteer work and advocacy efforts. The ceremony was simple and elegant, focused on commitment and partnership rather than romance and passion. As he looked at Helen, radiant in a simple blue dress that she'd chosen because it was practical and comfortable rather than dramatic, Robert thought about the difference between love and infatuation, between genuine connection and manufactured chemistry. He thought about Margaret, who would have liked Helen's intelligence and kindness, and about Siriporn, who had taught him painful but valuable lessons about trust and vulnerability. The most important lesson Robert learned from his experience wasn't about online dating or cultural differences or financial security. It was about the difference between loving someone and needing someone, between building a relationship based on genuine compatibility and trying to fill an emotional void with romantic fantasy. He learned that grief and loneliness could make anyone vulnerable to manipulation, but that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was part of being human. He learned that the shame of being victimised could be transformed into the strength to help others, that his experience with deception had made him more rather than less capable of recognising authentic relationships. Most importantly, he learned that love after loss was possible, but only when it grew from wholeness rather than desperation, from genuine connection rather than projected fantasy. His relationship with Helen wasn't a replacement for what he'd lost with Margaret or a fulfilment of what he'd imagined with Siriporn. It was something entirely new, built on the foundation of who he'd become through surviving both love and betrayal. If you're watching this story and recognizing elements of your own experience, please know that recovery is possible, that the shame and self-blame you're feeling will diminish with time and support. If you're considering online relationships, especially international ones, please research the person thoroughly, trust your instincts when something seems too good to be true, and never send money to someone you haven't met in person multiple times. Love is possible at any age and after any loss, but real love grows slowly and doesn't require financial proof of commitment. Real love doesn't create emergencies that only money can solve, doesn't pressure you to make rapid decisions, doesn't isolate you from friends and family who care about your well-being. Take care of yourselves, trust your instincts, and remember that loneliness is temporary. But the consequences of romance scams can last for years. Please subscribe to this channel, leave comments about your own experiences or questions, and stay tuned for more stories that might help you navigate the complex world of relationships and trust in the digital